there as well. She comes with a background in biology. I don't remember where you graduated from, but it doesn't
University
matter.
of Connecticut.
University of Connecticut. What's interesting, however, is when she went on to her postdoc, that's where she got interested in learning. So she's, since her postdoc time, she's blended both her interest in science and biology, and evolution in particular, and in learning. So it's wonderful to have you here. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. I found that I actually like seeing the forest through the trees, so interesting to hear what you say.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And I'll keep you a little bit on track,
Okay.
and I'll monitor the questions.
Throw something at me if I'm going over, as I dare stand away from this thing. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Everyone in the back can hear me all right? Fine, good. There is a mic there I could be wearing. I'm going to talk today about my interest in scientific reasoning, and I want to specify what I mean by scientific reasoning, because we read about it in a lot of different contexts. It's one of those things that we think we know what it means, but sometimes people are on different pages. For me, when I'm thinking about individuals reasoning in science, they're thinking systematically about variables that can be across scale, often using generalizations. And so this word abstraction is a very important one to me, and often in an attempt to explain particular phenomena. Now, again, abstraction, or this notion of taking away specific parameters to enable this broader sort of context-free thinking, is critical to this idea of scientific reasoning, right? We don't want to be so nested in context that we can't make the necessary generalizations or the necessary transfer to other contexts and other situations. And so for me, because I'm interested in the way that people abstract ideas, models are of critical importance, because models by definition are these simplified abstractions, right? If they were not, they would be the actual thing. And in this case, there are many ways in which people use models in science, and I'm interested in a diversity of ways that they do so. So for a number of you, this may look familiar. It is from the NRC Framework 2012. And in particular, thinking about the kind of the three dimensions of learning, we can think about these kind of disciplinary core ideas. We can think about these cross-cutting concepts, but we can also think about these practices, right? What is it that individuals are doing in this science context? And certainly things like asking questions, developing and using models, investigations, etc. These are the practices that, again, that 2012 report, which ultimately led to the Next Generation Science Standards, really emphasizes. For me, this evaluating scientific claims and investigations is a critical piece of that, as well as supporting these claims with evidence. And so to me, these claims serve as explanations. They are essentially models. And if we're going to use these models, we're going to think about this practice of argumentation, or how it is that people talk about the evidence, talk about the data, talk about the resources, and support or refute of particular claims or explanations or models. And so there are many different contexts where I study this. One important context is the undergraduate science laboratory, which this may look familiar to a number of you. Now, there have been, over the years, a series of complaints or issues about what happens in the undergraduate laboratory, the idea of recipes, cookbooks, right? Too many steps to how people need to conduct investigations. I'm not suggesting that happens here or in many of your own classes, but we know that people are still talking about the idea of what this lab manual does or does not tell students to do and how they tell them to do it. Often the materials for facilitating specific investigations are present, so it's not a wide open toolkit, but rather here are your resources to answer this question in this lab in this context. And then often what that leads to is that the solutions that students are generating, the ways in which they're solving problems in the lab, therefore can be highly context dependent as well. And like I said previously, that does sometimes make it difficult for students to draw those general parameters that they need to begin to think about ideas across those contexts, and then to be able to use them in a new place. So an example of such kind of cookbooky laboratory tasks might be something like this. This is a lab that you can get from Carolina Biological. For those of you unfamiliar with behavior type labs, these guys are pill bugs. They're little isopods, roly-polies. People played with them when they were kids. And the lab they give you kind of looks like this with all set items, including this two-way Petri dish, and you follow the directions and you come up with your result, and that's great. Well, I took this lab and I modified it. And I asked students to identify what type of habitat these guys might live in, right? So supposing they found a container of these organisms, the available equipment they have might be a whole bunch of things that may or may not be relevant to the investigation, and then basically gave them 4 simple steps of, figure it out and let us know what it says. And I had been working at the time as part of a project, part of the former National Science Foundation role grant opportunities with research and learning environments with an individual who had been working in physics education. And she was very interested in the ways that students ask and answer questions in labs in physics and how that might relate to biology. So I thought, since I had this modified lab, it might be a fun space for an investigation where I could use this very open-ended design task, if you will, in a context where I looked at both novice learners who hadn't had a lot of experience in these kind of lab environments, so freshmen and sophomore students, and compare those to expert learners who are students who had actually come back to graduate school for behavioral studies and animal behavior, and then also compared to expert, or I guess the quasi-expert, it might be what we might call them. These are graduate students, but they were graduate students in physics, right? So they were not graduate students in behavior. And ultimately, what I'm going to describe are the kinds of things we saw from the novices, the kinds of conversations, words people were using from the novices compared to the experts. And in this context, we boiled down novices to those introductory first and second year undergraduate students and the students that were second year physics graduate students, because their responses were very similar, and that the experts in this case are the graduate students in animal behavior. And so the first thing we saw was they had the equipment in front of them, they had these toys, they immediately started talking about that. Well, we're supposed to look at an environment. How many different environments do we have? Right? We have paintbrushes, so that's important. And so they began to take their items almost, like picking them up and looking at them and trying to fit them together to solve the problem. Little discussion about the problem without the tools. Whereas that was very different for the expert group, right? These guys immediately started talking, even though they didn't know that much about pill bugs. In fact, they didn't know anything about them at all. They began to ask questions about an environment they might live in. They began to talk about broader phenomena like energy sources for organisms. And then the novice group also began to sort of just take the items and one by one add them to the environment, whereas the experts were actually deciding what they would do before they started doing it. And that led them to kind of fewer take it apart and try it again kind of solutions. And the other thing was the creativity, right? So novices just took that one double-way Petri dish, right, and just said, well, I guess one side and the other side, that's what we'll do. Even though they had created like 4 or 5 different environments, they had no way, it wasn't really a dichotomous question, so they had no way of ruling out alternatives. So the end result of what they came up with didn't give them much at all. Where again, the experts sort of began thinking about the different treatments and how they would overlay it, right? And so this finding is probably not all that surprising, but when we move this to a more controlled study, and by controlled, we took students out of a classroom. These were sophomore science students. They came out of classroom time to sit down. I took another one of those Carolina kits dealing with plant transpiration and modified that, and basically gave one group the lab, right, with the equipment, and I gave the other group the same exact lab, but without the materials and equipment. So and both groups had the same task of not actually setting up the lab, but writing what they would do. And again, our hypothesis in this particular investigation was that without having the equipment there in front of them, right, they would be able to potentially reason in a more global, right, context. They'd potentially draw in more of what they thought about in the outside world into their solution set. And so our coding scheme really focused on that context, right? And when I'm talking about context, I'm talking about what's on that lab bench right there, right? And what it is that they're picking up and thinking about versus outside of the lab bench, what they might know from a textbook or what they might know from the world around them. And then the planning, like what do they decide to do and when do they decide to do it? And then lastly, the creativity, the number of different ways. These are design experiments. They're very common in physics and even some chemistry labs. We may see them less often in some of the broadly disseminated biology type lab materials. But the idea is this: you will design an experiment to test what are the multiple ways you could test that notion. And what we found, if you look at the data right here, we're just looking at time to be done with writing out this response, right? They worked in teams. So that's just literally in minutes, right? So the without materials group worked faster than the with materials group. But then also on a coding scale of 0 to 3, and the greater the number, the more sophisticated, if you will, that response, we found that individuals without the material tended to have more sophisticated responses, right? Their solutions, number one, they came up with more of them. That's simple. Number two, they brought in some of their outside knowledge. They asked questions like, well, what do we know about plants? Well, knowing this about a tree might help us to understand X, Y, and Z, right? Without being asked to do that. Whereas the group with the materials really focused on, I even tossed in things like I gave them nail polish for no real reason. And so two groups, like we're talking about how you would paint the plants or something. It was just, some of them were even painting even though they weren't doing the lab. So it was this idea that we wouldn't have been given it unless it was absolutely essential to our problem. And no thinking at all about the fact that this is nail polish. And so, I went backwards, sorry. Am I going forward here? There we go. All right. So basically, with these novice students, when posed with this typical situation, focus very quickly on the available materials, focus very quickly on what in that context can help them think about what it was they can think about, right? That's very different than the way we'd expect experts in that situation to reason. And so that paper, which actually, Joe, you were an editor on that paper for JARS at the time, it was extremely helpful. Really caused me and some colleagues, Ravit Duncan in particular, to think about what is it that they're thinking about when they're thinking about science. And so we borrowed some concepts like Rosalind Driver's sort of image of science to ask, when these students are talking about this kind of broad scientific enterprise, what are they thinking about? And so this particular study that Ravit Duncan and I did really looked at students' impressions of ecology, genetics, and science at large. But as part of that broader study, we did a draw a scientist task. And so I love showing this picture from the publication because it was really emblematic of what students were saying. That, when you ask someone, and for people familiar with the draw a scientist task, it's a culturally driven kind of construct that you get somebody kind of Einstein-y looking. I just think the geneticist is sort of interested in that, like a little neater, maybe kind of clean up the lab environment. But then this ecologist, right, is very different. And we got quotes like, there's real science, and then there's like genetics that's real science, and like ecology is not, right? You don't have the replication, you don't have the control. And everything in their descriptions in this study was talking about like right there in the lab bench, right, in that kind of environment. So the idea that we could ask and answer questions beyond that notion of we got to have 30 replicates and X amount of controls was completely underappreciated. And when it came to any kind of the idea of inference, right, and that's what we do so often in science, students barely knew what that was even when it was explained to them. And so that they were very positivist is the word for that, right? We look, we see, we touch it, and that's how we know it. And so like the idea of models that I've been talking about was completely underappreciated in this group. And so this kind of, what I'm calling is lack of integration between the classroom context and that lived experience, right? We've seen that. Everyone here who teaches probably can just sort of nod their heads. You can go ahead and nod if you want to. That you've seen this in your students, right? That it's like bringing in what's going on in the real world is so tough, right? And we know that experts, even though they were learners, they were new to these pill bugs and things like that, were bringing their outside world into context, into that classroom, right? And so we saw that in that experiment, right, that they, without being given those materials, I am making the argument that they move between that context to the more semi-generic layer of abstraction, right? I'm not suggesting that people can have complex reasoning strategies without any context at all. You need something to reason about, absolutely. But that if we don't bring our learners up just a little bit out of that context, how can we expect them to draw those relationships between these different contexts to then hold on to core ideas that they can apply in new situations? And so that's what really stemmed some of my collaboration, more so with Cindy Mello-Silver, which Joe mentioned she was here a couple weeks ago. How many of you were here for her talk? Some of you? It's a fair number, okay, great. And she and I were talking a lot about there's this great deal of resources out there to help our learners with models and great tools, but we felt like there needed to be some cognitive tools associated with that as well, right? They needed to have ways of thinking about things that perhaps move beyond the simple heuristics. And so we formed a reading group. Really, we're thinking a lot about conceptual representations. Cindy will tell you she had done some work with some folks down at Georgia Tech looking at some of these kinds of representations or ontologies for artificial intelligence. And so she was bringing that to our conversation. And I believe during her talk, or at least she told me during her talk, that she talked about this kind of structure, behavior, function moved to something that was kind of components, mechanisms, phenomena as a conceptual representation for thinking about systems. And I think in many ways that explicit attention helped learners move beyond what was visible, absolutely. Their narratives, which were very linear, became more system appreciative, right, and more dynamic. But, and this is the part that you can't tell her that I told you, but there are some things missing from that. And so the idea, so she probably didn't talk a lot about learning transfer or what students did in these kind of novel situations, and that's because it was very, very limited. We didn't see that based on this conceptual representation alone. There needs to be more. And we don't want to force over-reliance on tools without also encouraging or scaffolding the thinking associated with the tools. And so this is the CMP 2.0 that she didn't talk to you about, but that we have published, where, again, we're thinking about phenomena, mechanism, and components, right? You notice I reversed the order on her. And that is, and again, we're taking students from these kinds of, in this case, we're talking about ecosystems. So this is a system conceptual representation. And the phenomena, or the pattern, that's what we're trying to explain, right? That is our claim, our explanation, whatever you want to call it. This is what I want students to articulate first. There's something we see. There's an I wonder. I was looking outside, I noticed there's something, right, that we need to articulate. Else why are we modeling, right? I don't think it's all that useful to say to the students, well, model the parking lot outside, right? Because they will come up with all sorts of things that may or may not be relevant to what you actually want them thinking about. But if we can say, all right, there's some pattern or something we see, then let's think about those models from that framework. Now what's really important here, I think, is this idea of M before C. And again, I've made the argument that students tend to be a little bit over-reliant on the parts of the system. So if they're looking out at that parking lot, they're starting to talk about cars, they're forgetting that there are all sorts of mechanisms that they bring to the table that they already know about or have learned about, right? And so those experiences, those semi-generic type processes, those things that are true across contexts, students have those and can bring those to bear. I think they need to be reminded. And I'll give you an example of that. And then always within this context of you're supporting the explanation with evidence, right? Or refuting the explanation with evidence, or changing the explanation based on the evidence. And so to articulate this in a different way, we can highlight a phenomena, right? So they can look at, and Cindy may have talked about this a little bit as well, this idea that the students were, I think she showed the video, probably she likes to show a video. Do you guys see a video of like David Meller and the pond problem? So she likes to set it up like, oh no, there are these, it's a cute video, but there are these like dead fish, what's happened, right? To get as this kind of motivating context. And then sort of, now we must begin the investigation. And we know what novice learners tend to do is they tend to want to rush out there, they want to look at everything around there, they want to start drawing relations based on what they see immediately. And they forget to ask this question. And I think that question, I'm going to argue, is really important if we expect them to start moving up this level of abstraction. So what could have happened? Right? And they come to the table with those mechanisms. They know that, they know why things are alive and they know why they're dead. Right? So they can start to say, oh, not enough oxygen. Okay, maybe too much CO2. All right, maybe they've been eaten. Maybe they, right? And what I'm arguing is that sets up multiple plausible alternatives. And if they forget to think about that, then it puts an over-reliance on what they're seeing in the context, and they're taking that and they're fitting it to the narrative of what they already think happens. And that's really not how we do science, right? We try to think about various explanations, right? We rule out different ideas, which means we have to have different ideas. And so the kids, if you ask a bunch of 7th graders, or even a bunch of college students, or even a bunch of adults, because I've asked them all, these are the kinds of things they come up with, very sophisticated responses, right? But then we now can look to the field, we can look to the context or the environment to talk about what's plausible, right? So it's those multiple alternatives, but now multiple plausible alternatives of what could have actually happened. And that's where they can begin to rule out things like they were all eaten up. Well, if they were all eaten up, then we wouldn't see them lying there dead unless they were regurgitated or something. Right? And so this is how we'd ask students to build those kinds of models, right? So after they've had this kind of thinking, where they articulate, okay, here's our phenomena, dead fish, here's my possible mechanisms, then they can start filling out their boxes, so to speak. And we do this on paper, and then I'll show you how we moved it to a computer environment, where now they'll start, and this is a very typical student model, okay, well, we got fish, we got dead, we got water, and we could begin to say, we got many. These are things they put in boxes. It's stinky, and they're sure it stinks whether or not they've been there. But then we can begin to have them start to parallel structure in their model a little bit, to say many. Is many a part in your model? What's many referring to? Oh, well, maybe many fish. Okay, fish are dead. Okay, so maybe that's a property of the fish, right? Odor, you could have something that's odor, that's bad odor, or you could say the water has bad odor. There's no right or wrong way. It's just that kind of thinking to help them begin to build up this system and to allow themselves to come up with these mechanistic chains of events that may occur. And so, as they begin to talk about oxygen, they can then talk about too high, too low, and how they want to frame that. They can then draw the arrows between them, and these arrows together and their links will often show us broader mechanisms. And then, again, that when I say plausible alternatives, that's coming from the evidence. They're not doing this without receiving evidence. They ask questions, right? What was the temperature of the water? What happened the night before? They're bringing these things in, and we can provide them with that type of evidence. But what we're asking them to do is keep track. So for every link, every contention, every claim, they provide the evidence for that claim. And then to formalize that, what Cindy talked about was a version of a program that was used for that project that I actually don't use now. Stephen Gray is sitting right here. I'm going to show some of the modeling software that he's developed, but he introduced me to his programmer, and they've got a great interface. And so we've created this eco-modeler, which allows the learners to articulate a phenomena up here. It allows them to put in notes, to color code, to add different properties, to draw on the arrows. So your standard kind of conceptual mapping tool, in this case, very constraint-free, web-based, very simple, but it fits nicely with what I'm asking them to do in that I can put, what is your phenomenon? I can put in these questions right here. So we can preload that. The students can then answer it depending on the situation or how you want to work with this. So it's really an excellent sort of mental organizing tool. And so basically, and now this is on undergraduate students again, we can use some of the tools that Cindy showed you, and that was just a part of the overall suite of tools we have. So students encounter an issue with nitrogen overload in an aquarium. Students encounter an issue with this dead fish in a pond and eutrophication, and then students encounter an issue with climate. And so we're arguing that this PMC, or at least in this case, testing the hypothesis that this kind of adding this richness to this curriculum will result in these kind of more mechanistic types of explanations, sort of, compared to the pre-assessment. And so this is the college classroom. You can see where we had big ideas. We had in some field trips, some readings. We didn't cover, this is an environmental issues class. We didn't cover a heck of a lot of issues, but what we covered, we really covered in depth. And so just to highlight for you the data sources that we used for this investigation, it was a very small class. So this is a pilot study. We have about 13 kids in the group. This was it was a pilot for some of these 21st century integration skill courses that Rutgers University has now broadened, so every student needs to take one. Some of us were able to kind of mess around a little bit ahead of time before they made it a requirement for every student at the university, and that's what this was. So we got to have a lot of fun with this. And I got to look at some of their models that they drew by hand, and also look at some of their eco-modeler models. And we've done some comparisons through that I can talk about at another time. But this is a kind of model then that you'd see from a typical, and these kids were sophomores and juniors. Basically this model is talking about eutrophication. That's the eutrophication story. I've sort of just put red around the different components, or what we were saying are C's, if you will. And then I have this is the phenomena, a little red arrow is pointing to that phenomena, the dead zone in this case of what they're articulating. And then we have these big mechanisms, right? These big M's that these students have learned about in previous classes that we're saying you've got to bring this into this problem context. And so eutrophication, consumption of food webs, and photosynthesis, or lack thereof. These students were science students, but it's amazing how many of them couldn't really articulate photosynthesis that well, or couldn't really talk about eutrophication that well. And so these were collaborative groups. The individuals had to do individual modeling, but they ultimately came up with problem sets in collaborative groups. And so what you're seeing are these more collaborative type models where somebody in the group usually can help the rest of the group members articulate these ideas outside of that context that they have often had to in the past. And in this one, we're seeing two different types of phenomena in terms of global temperature and global temperature rise. So this is a carbon problem, and we're looking at the different components, and then we're looking at the different mechanisms like mitigation. What does that mean in the social ecological context? Looking at greenhouse effect. So these are the ways that we could look at the models, and then we compare that information with the written responses that they gave us. And so I'm just going to show you some of the data we've gotten from that. Again, small class, very tiny class. So I'm just giving you kind of raw numbers at some level. That the number of students that we had, right there, all there, and then the sort of the where they were in terms of the number of phenomena. They were talking about patterns. We asked them to model something. And a lot of them were just giving a model of everything they could think of. I couldn't pull out of it, and I couldn't pull out of their explanation, what are you modeling, right? And so obviously, without surprise, that would change after we said, okay, phenomena are these things you're modeling, so please give us phenomena, and no surprise, they were able to do that at some level. The surprising one, I guess, were the few that weren't. But then this idea of adding a mechanistic explanation to that model. So not just the parts, but how the parts function together, and how that relates to the outcome. That's something that we saw change, right? 8 students of our group, actually, I'm getting numbers saying, wait, yeah. 8 students of our 13, right, actually added mechanistic explanations when they didn't have them before. And then you can look at these elements, these kind of PMC elements, versus the individual models and the group models. And you see that group models, not surprisingly, they're adding a lot more on average, right? And this is just taken across all 3 contexts. The nitrogen, the dead fish in a pond, carbon, and we're seeing on average, repeatedly, they're coming up. Yeah, they're adding some more parts, although they're mid-stage models. If you're interested in that, tells a story very similarly to the one that Tammy Long has talked with me about, where the models become sort of complicated a little bit and then maybe a little less complicated. So we do see that kind of shift, but sort of if you're looking at pre to post, slightly more in that respect in both cases, but that you're seeing more come out of the group, right? Mechanism about the same, but you're seeing more phenomena. Now again, this is a small group. We really want to replicate this with a larger group to see if these patterns hold. But what I thought was interesting was that the model sophistication on the individual level was correlated with the overall course grade. Now all those models we had them do, that was really only 5% of the course grade, so it's not a case of the course grade is based on these models, so not surprisingly. And that this increase in sophistication, the fact that they're actually taking and adding in things, being told, don't forget to add in things you think about, not surprisingly, got them to add in some things so they can think about from their other classes when it comes to what do trees and plants do, right? What is this issue with carbon and mitigation, right? If you kind of get them to pause and think and then start to put the pieces together, especially in a collaborative context, we see that conversation changing to one that's more akin to that kind of expert conversation. Now again, I think I mentioned this as part of a broader curriculum initiative, but actually it also serves as a test to think about, could we use model-based learning in our introductory biology classes at Rutgers as well? Okay, so that gives you some perspective of the research and the kinds of questions I like to ask, both from a little while ago up to what we're doing now in some ways. But I want to move us more to a kind of a meso scale and then conclude with more of the macro scale. But so this idea of the models, again, when I had approached some of the folks who were teaching our introductory biology, they were thinking, sure, what? You want to put a model in beginning, end, you want to put a model in the middle? And I'm saying it's a way of life for science, right? It's a way of thinking. That models as explanations, we are continually posing explanations and looking for evidence to support or refute that. That's the heart of science. It's not added in on a one Wednesday a month kind of thing. And so I did find some success in thinking about reform in a middle school classroom, actually, in New Jersey. So basically, I wanted to move from this model as a tool for thinking and assessment, right, in the classroom to actually integrate some of the work that Stephen, who's been a great colleague and collaborator, has done, where the idea of modeling could actually be used for more community learning and actually decision making, especially as it pertains to environmental issues. And so the interface has changed a little bit here from the previous one you saw, not just the color, but rather these arrows, suddenly you don't put words on them. They have positive and negative directions, right? And you don't actually add different characteristics of those components. But otherwise, this interface should look pretty similar to the previous one, right? Your nods are helpful. And so Stephen and I have a grant where we're looking at the model-based learning in actually informal learners and citizen scientists. And so I took some of those tools and brought them into the classroom. And the idea For this particular class, the instructor of this class was doing some doctoral research on problem-based learning, wanted to deal with a good problem to dig into. I have another grant in Baltimore looking at Asian tiger mosquito control, and in particular how individuals in that context, in the community context, reason with the data that they're given to make decisions about controlling this invasive mosquito. And so I took some of those materials, we adapted them for the classroom, typical middle schooler model, and the idea was that these guys wanted to prevent West Nile, and then Zika came about, and so some of these prevalent diseases that are mosquito-based. And so the idea that we have is that individuals may have these kind of mental models, right, that we're now going to encourage them to make that thinking explicit, right, and then to merge those kinds of models. And that's what the software allows us to do without necessarily having to kind of try to cut and paste sheets of paper and to take that amount of time. And it allows us to build very complex models, lots of arrows, lots of things that sometimes can be a little bit difficult to make sense of, but that the software also gives us other interfaces to think about that information, such that we can have students begin to think about scenarios. What if we did this? What if we added a little of that? What if we took away this? What if we tried this mosquito control strategy versus that mosquito control strategy? And then you would see outcomes. You would say, well, you get more of this or less of that, right? Now, it's only as good as the model they built. It's not based on anything other than that. But it does give students the opportunity to go look at an outcome and say, that's not right. And then try to go back and see what relations they're building. Or to look at an outcome and say, that could happen. What is it that we need to know? How are we going to link between our data, or our model, and potentially the data that are out there? And so that's a good position to put students in, because now they want to get the data. And so here it was pretty easy, right? There's so much new tool development out there in the world, right? That we don't need to design anything. In this case, we were able to just take GIS layers. So they collected mosquito data from all of where they were living, brought it into the classroom, and they could actually test hypotheses about where they thought tree cover was and things like that. Thinking the mosquitoes were primarily associated with large areas of tree covers, not the case. They tested that idea. And for me, this is very important because we want to make the most of the given time that we have with students. So often I hear teachers complain, so often, even in my own classroom, I think, this is taking too much time. I want to get them to a different place, right? It's so hard to make them do it outside of class, too. But I also want to make the most out of that context that we're in. I think we can be so constrained by how we think about a classroom space. And so, traditionally, coming from more ecological environmental sciences, of what does in the field mean, we take them out to pristine and perhaps experimental plots. But the field means a lot more than that, right? The field can mean abandoned buildings, the field can mean your schoolyard, the field can mean so much more. And I argue that's true of the science laboratory too, especially now with the technology that we have available. So that you can use some pretty sophisticated tools out in the field, but in the classroom, could they be collecting data? Some of these students, sitting in an office, collecting data on people, but relating that to ecological contexts. And so this, I think, reflects what I'm calling this kind of ever-changing science identity of our learners, right? We see a science for use in a way that maybe we haven't in classrooms 20 or 30 years ago. How do we capitalize on that? And so again, I mentioned we have a grant where we're working with citizen scientists to set up tools to enable them to reason about particular problems that they're having in their context. And so the idea has been, let's go ahead and adapt it for teaching and learning for classroom context. And that really leads us to think about the kinds of questions we're having them ask in the classroom. And I think that's perhaps the most important piece. Then instead of what are we having them do, what are they asking? What are they thinking about? And so this integration problem I'm talking about with the lived experience and that classroom experience, I've been thinking a lot about sort of thinking social ecologically about systems, right? That we live in an environment, that is where we exist. Let's bring it all in together, right? Let's take the science, let's think about social science. So some of my work has really drawn in some of that as well to provide learners, middle schoolers, got one project in elementary school, to really think about these problems in a much more sophisticated way than we have in the past. And to really think about our planet and its capacity to respond to change, because we know that change is happening and happening fast. And so here's, a kind of a typical question, the role of riparian buffers along a stream, typical kind of ecology question that students may ask in a lab and have in this particular lab in Virginia. And then have them begin to model alternatives, begin to think about that before we have them go on out and start collecting data. And then get them out there, and then think about who, in this project, students are out there with community members. Because a lot of people are invested in why and what's happening there, and the outcome of that information. And then having them, again, get the evidence, support models, or again, refute models, using, and now we're setting up, they don't really love coliform bacteria, it turns out. And when we go into great details of microbiology and bacteria, it's not like, yes, I've been waiting my whole life to hear this, but when it comes to thinking about some of the outcome, and I don't want to by any means disparage any microbiologists here, because I have been waiting my whole life to hear that. They can then take data, they can then begin to do what we do in all science classrooms, begin to visualize ideas, begin to put them together. But that's relevant for them. It's not necessarily relevant for people, other people, who may be sitting in a school or sitting in a college classroom in the middle of Baltimore, right? Where I mentioned I have that other project. And so this is a project that students are asking in this context, and this is their field. It's very different. And so here, again, working with underserved communities, because that's who lives here. This is a mosquito hotspot. They're there. They know that it's a problem. If you guys have ever encountered mosquitoes, you can tell when mosquitoes are a problem, right? And so to engage these folks was very interesting for teachers in the schools, university students. So here you're seeing community members, local school members, and university students working collaboratively to answer those questions using some of these model-guided tools. But now, to kind of conclude, let's take that one step out to kind of this macro environment. And we, and so many of you here on the search committee and others whose work I know and know well, if you guys get it at some level, right? We all say this to each other, well, you get what I'm saying, you understand. But I think so many of us here understand the value of thinking about how it is we engage our learners really purposefully and what it is we ask them to do, right? And many people here love models and model-based learning just as much as I do. So that's great. But how do we take the power and the strength that's in this room and continue to spread it and to continue to reach that arm out so that, if I came in and gave a talk like this saying, hey, look what we found, people would be like, of course. That would be the ideal world. It's almost to write myself out of any need. And again, I think we need to work with our institutional leaders, which many of you have, but it's sort of systemic, right? Ground up, top down, we've heard this before, but it is time consuming, it's iterative, and it's collaborative. And I say that because you guys know this website better than I do, although I've learned Spartans will. Lots of folks have said that to me, so I'm excited, and all your little things in your parking lots are letting me know that Spartans will do so many things, and so that's exciting. But that this kind of burden of this positive change, right, falls on the champions, leaders, right? We have a shared vision. It's often the vision that isn't entirely off. Sometimes it is, but not often. And give a safe place to model and test our models collaboratively. Well, what does this sound like, right? It sounds like what I've been talking about, what we expect of our learners. Could be something that we could be doing together at the level of administrators, at the level of institutions, where we sit down and create models and create theory of change and explain why that happens. And we tried a project like that at the Social Ecological Synthesis Center in Annapolis, where we brought together people from different fields at the first level to create a model that was looking at climate and climate change, in particular from this perspective of mitigation adaptation. So we had social scientists, we had experts from all over to come and help create the basis for this. Then we had curricular experts come for another iteration to help think about what needs to be in place to help students think about these important things that so many researchers have said is important. Then at the last stage, right, we sat down with people who are making decisions cross-curricularly. This was at Rutgers University, and there were some other universities represented at the table as well, to now think about what we do. And so in the same way that we had individual scientists coming to the table saying, all right, well, here's my model, using my equal-modeler tool, or using mental modeler, typing in their models, that we can merge, that we can begin talking about our theory of change. We're doing that at the level of, okay, so how do we as experts think we can integrate this across curriculum? And so in that respect, decision-making becomes a little more systematic, it feels systematic, and it feels like we all have a voice in a way that maybe we didn't before. And that kind of change, or thinking about what we do in that context, is something that for so many of us who are interested in the way people learn and how people do what they do, can be a very comfortable environment. And so it's the way of taking something, a concept in this context, and using it in another, and another, and another, that to me is so interesting, and there's so much opportunity, especially at a place like Michigan State. So thank you. I want to thank Stephen again for help with the slides, my graduate student Amanda Sorensen, the ton of collaborators whose names were listed throughout. National Science Foundation has largely supported the work, although we've gotten some work from the Institute of Educational Sciences and the Department of Education as well. So thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and discussion and issues and all that kind of good stuff. So.
Stunned them to silence. Oh, thank you.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I think a lot of what you talked fits with what we're doing here at Create, model-based thinking. I want to ask you, you presented an interesting approach of starting with talking about what is the mechanism and what could have happened to explain the phenomena, and I think it's very interesting. I wonder, what do you think could happen if you start with the components and not with the mechanism? And I relate it to a problem that we see in our studies, that students find it difficult to switch from thinking about objects to thinking about variables that are measurable, that can be manipulated.
That's interesting. So did everyone hear that question? Yep, good. We did, so one of the studies, Cindy and I worked with a graduate student who, I think she's about ready to publish it, so I think I'm not spilling anything too exciting, but looking at that kind of, when they did this CMP, they tended to have that components first perspective. Some of the things we found, which I'm sure she maybe highlighted a little bit with the SBF, but it's this kind of strange one-to-one where there's a part, it does something, right? So here's my part, it has a mechanism, and then everything else, right? So there's like this big black box where there's this one-to-one part, and then the whole thing works. And that's not quite how it happens, right? There are these pieces that, like, how do the parts come together to create a phenomena, so to speak, when it comes to like eutrophication, where we are thinking about photosynthesis, we're thinking about decomposition, we're thinking about those pieces. And so once we got them to think about that, they can often start to say, all right, well, photosynthesis, I guess you got a plant, sun, and then the more savvy might say something like water. And then, so they start to pull that together a little bit, and then they start to put that down, and then they begin to look in the place to say, oh, there's our sun, there's our, so they want to you want to try these one-to-one matches all the time. That's, I think, understandable given that this is a new situation. When it comes to variables, and they had a harder time, and that's why in the eco-modeler we began to add these sort of characteristics, these places to add variables and what that means. Or at least if they're not going to understand that entirely, if they're going to think about change and the rate of change, what are they measuring that in? So giving them some space to begin to articulate those pieces so that they can think about, all right, so what would that look like in our system, and then how does that look on a graph? And I've done some programming using NetLogo, which some of which Cindy's used in that project, which was very important to me to look at the agents and the graph. So, but you've got to slow them down, and a lot of our teachers necessarily weren't on board with that, to say, all right, stop, everything's like trial and error, right? And that's not quite how we do science all the time, where it's like, all right, I'm going to turn we're going to add 100 fish and see what happens. We're going to add no fish and see what happens. But instead to think about what in the system might make sense in terms of number of fish or something like that. And so then they're looking at fish, and then they can sort of start to see counts. But it's kind of working with the fact that they want a one-to-one match, kind of in a way, to sort of say, okay, this means the same thing as this. And so even with like a graphing the data, it's like, all right, show it in a different way. Show it in a different way. And so it's always, all right, if this simulation is showing the agents, what might it look like if you're just looking at outputs and inputs in a model that might be drivers and source sync kind of models, which NetLogo allows you to do a little bit of. But that really requires the educator to be comfortable with that material. And so when we've seen that done well, when they've worked from the parts to the pieces to the phenomena, it's because the educator could recognize, oh, you know what, try it this way, flip it that way. And so one of our biggest challenges, which I don't know if Cindy discussed or not, but is getting that person comfortable with the science to be able to encourage multiple perspectives, multiple ways. What happens if I reverse the axes? What happens if the line gets inverted? What does that mean? How is a line depicting a relationship? So those kinds of questions. So like I said before, I still argue it's those questions, the nature of the questions that get the mind to think a little bit differently, that I think can really bring out that kind of thinking. Does that answer your question a little bit? That's the best of what we know, so I'm not sure we've looked at it in the same way you guys have.
So I was wondering about connecting across your studies that you showed. So, in your first study, from what I understood, you were saying that the context that the students weren't in, so and the way that you conceptualized that was like the materials that they had.
That's part of it, yeah.
The materials constrained the way that they thought about doing the experiment. In the next set, you were looking at this eco-modeler and the mental modeler and sort of how that helps them do mechanism and think about mechanisms. I was wondering if you have thought about across those studies how the eco-modeler and the variables and the things that you're actually giving them to define, how those could be thought of as contexts or as tools, and how those constrain, what are the affordances and constraints of those as objects in that same way that you did in the first study.
Absolutely, and it's an excellent question, and definitely. And the way, did everyone hear that question? And so, that design the tool of how we designed the eco-modeler especially, and why we moved to the interface more that we ultimately did, was because of this constant interplay between how much are we giving, how much are we constraining what it is they're thinking about by just the interface alone, let alone anything else, let alone talking about the variables, right? And how much, and that's why it's kind of multimedia, where it's like, all right, you're looking at a graph here, you're looking at the agents there, we've actually got the living aquarium, and you've got measurements here, trying to just give them the same idea in different contexts, and hoping and trying to help scaffold their ability to generalize was important. But one of the things like we did was the students, the boxes are kind of dull. So one student said, well, I want pictures. And so I thought, all right, pictures, you can add in pictures if you want. So instead of the box, just put a representative. But we found that it was a lot harder to get them to think about this sort of more conceptual aspect of like food web. Like they just kept trying to get the big things to eat the little things. So if this fish eats that fish, it's got to be bigger. So then they were like running out of space on the page, so they were trying to tell a very literal story with the pictures. So quickly we were like, all right. Take away the ability to use these pictures because we weren't getting very far. Because the pictures were really, I think, bringing them to a context they were very comfortable in a more narrative way. And then even the arrows, like that's why we have so many different interfaces. Because what might you put on an arrow and how might that guide your thinking? Students to see something with pluses and minuses, I think, unless you really scaffolded the way they're thinking about that, I think can mean so many things to different individuals that it's really hard to get them on the same page as well. And so, without a doubt, that's why we tried to make it the interface as free and as open as it will. Free financially it is, but as open in terms of as much real estate on that page, as much opportunity, so we don't actually say give us phenomena, we don't actually say those things. You can put them in there, or you can keep it completely blank. And to try to help the educator also determine what that context is going to be. And even the environment, right? That's one of the questions we're asking, sitting there on a computer versus drawing it on paper, right? There's different ways we think about things in that way too. So yeah, I think it's very important that, that is a tool that we're giving them. What does that afford? And how does it limit? And always there's a limitation. And so how can we keep it varied enough so that they really are seeing the forest through the trees is a challenge constantly.
In your study looking at the students who were given materials and those who were not given materials, what were some drawbacks that you saw in the group that did not have the materials? So I was curious if, like, sometimes if you have like the world to imagine, you can come up with all sorts of things that are really not productive for answering the question. So I was just curious if that was...
I mean, that definitely occurred in that I think, for example, there were some designs that I think they forgot basic principles of like cohesion or some of the things that is very important to think about when you're thinking about transpiration or how that works. That some of the world to the table kind of, oh, we could do this, we could do that. They definitely had some that it was like you're forgetting a principle here. To me, that actually was great in a sense because it brought up an opportunity to really push the boundaries of their knowledge in a way that if they just kind of fell in line and sync, I don't know if they really understand it, if they just memorized it well. And so talking about the kind of limitations of the design or what they were missing actually enabled a very rich discussion. And so these kids were volunteers that came, they just got fed some pizza. But a number of them stayed on to actually think about, how does this work, And so there was a little bit of discussion. It was like in the evening, and so we were there pretty late. And so I think that there's the tools remind us of a constrained world, but it also might help remind us of constrained principles that we learn about, like, and thinking about something like transpiration is tough, but sometimes, if they could take a straw and dip it in water and take their thumb out, like so many of us did as kids, it starts thinking in a way that you don't necessarily have that play. So I think there's a lot of creativity with the tools as well. It's sort of everything, right? People always say this depends on the goal, what you're trying to do. But I think that the tools can be rather helpful. In the case of like a dichotomous design, I think in that case it forced it too much. In the case of this transpiration lab too, they weren't really thinking of it like a tube, they just couldn't, I think they had difficulty thinking about, like xylem as how would that work, that water goes up through it, because they think about them as individual cells, and so how does this knock into that? And so, but it enabled me to sit there and say, I wonder how many other students in my own instruction was able to go back and say, this might have been tough. So I think, again, it did open up my eyes to some things, but I wouldn't necessarily, there's a space for creativity, and that's great, if you're actually wanting to have a lab be focused on data analysis, give them the tools. Tell them exactly how to do it at some level, because you're never going to the point where you get the data set big enough to begin to use and think about. So I think that's important as well.
Other questions, comments?
I was curious about the collaborative nature of the sort of concept mapping
Mhm.
that you were doing there. Does that, so it allows like overlap? And I guess sort of wondering also how is that working in the classroom? Is that like across different groups or?
Yeah, so it differs. And in the classrooms, in the middle school classrooms, a bunch of them sat around a computer. We try to make it as small a group as possible so one person isn't doing all the modeling. So they had to trade up. Sometimes the instructor made them, okay, hand it to this person, okay, hand it to that person, to get them all in the typing seat. When it comes to what we're doing more in the college classroom, because we had a cloud drive, people can just put the model in that drive and somebody else can take it and open it and add to it. So that kind of collaboration was happening at that level. When you move to Mental Modeler, we had students we can merge different students' models so that we're putting it onto the same page so they can look at it together. So in that way, collaboration literally took different models and put it together. And so in the undergraduate classroom, where, especially in the experimental class, we were doing all sorts of collaboration in that way. But there was, and all that everybody has, I got a grant, so everybody had a tablet in front of them. So theoretically, it's hard to follow everyone in the classroom, but they all could have the model open right in front of them. And if we worked in the class, we could project it and things like that. So it wasn't, I didn't want to case somebody over here doing that and then the other group members kind of twiddling their thumbs or something.
So I'll look back to Tom's first question,
Okay.
so which was about the parts of the components.
Okay, yeah.
So how do you think about mechanisms if you don't know the parts of the system?
Yeah, it's so, I mean,
Right?
that's...
I'm
that's-
struggling with that.
Mhm.
I'm really trying to figure out, like, to me, the phenomena is always first. So you have to have the thing you're trying to model in front of you.
Mhm.
But you have to then, once you have that, you have to say, well, what goes in to impact that, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't have those parts, how do you think of the,
And that's what I'm arguing. So I'm not saying, I don't want us to go too far up this chain of abstraction or however we want to view it. So they do have the parts of a system. They just don't necessarily have that one. So if they think about a pond, for example, all the kids, the seventh graders, I did a lot of just sort of sitting in the middle of the room and just talking with them before we dug into some of this stuff. And I said, well, tell me about a typical pond. They can say things like fish. They could say things like rocks and trees and things like that, ducks, And so when it came to what could kill a fish, starvation, they had the mechanism of there's food for fish in pond. But the key was they didn't necessarily know what was in that pond yet, in that phenomena. So once I thought about starvation was a very popular response, pollution, very popular response, predation, also very popular. Then we could say, okay, in this context, what would you expect to see? Some people, muck floating on the top of it. Oh, is muck pollution? Yes, and then others, well, not necessarily, So it's that kind of conversation. So they do always have part of the mechanism. And so that's why I kind of call it we're just going up a little bit so that they can think maybe, what would your expectation be in that pond? But certainly, when we couch the scenario, like I'll say in the classroom, passion puddle, which they have familiarity right out there. Or in some of the other classrooms, we've looked around and said that one. So even some of the context of is this a well-lit pond versus one that has lots of trees? Is this one where there's lots of runoff versus one that's managed in that college classroom? They're bringing those parts. So I don't want them to think about it. So mechanisms, that's why they don't model. They can't model until they start with the components. Those boxes are parts. You can't put anything down without C.
Right, so your mechanisms are actually factors that might impact the outcome.
Mm-hmm. And so they could feed back. So they can serve as these causal agents. They could serve as these mitigating factors, right? They can serve, so that's why we kind of went with mechanisms instead of causes, because even doing some reading, thinking about maybe like how Tina Grotzer, her group at Harvard, thinks about causal pieces, and yet how some other folks like, we used Mackamer's coding scheme to think about mechanisms, that it's not a one-to-one alignment, so we try to keep it a little bit open by just saying these broader processes maybe, or mechanistic processes. But if we can't pause them for a second to say, what could, what might, what do you know about, what operates here, then I think that's where we start to fall into this kind of getting mired in the trees trap.
So, in scientific modeling, we're often aiming for simplicity and coherence and parsimony. And so I see these models that, you start with a cluster and another cluster and so forth, and that looks like it's sort of going the opposite direction. What's the nature of the selection pressure to help students move toward simpler, more coherent, more parsimonious?
I think the pressure really is they can't solve the problem, they can't reason with it. It's just too big. And I think, so that's part of it. I think once they begin to confront like the visualization, once they begin to look at the multiple parts in that second screen where I showed that they can sort of look at relative amounts of parts in that system. And if you add this and take away that, you might expect to see more of this, but then they saw less of that. Where's the problem? And so there's part of that is the pressure. And the other issue is with these models, and we really do see it in almost all the contexts, we see them build, we see them come together, they build, and then it gets complicated and not very useful for their cause. And then we start to deconstruct. And so we tend to see a little more complicated than where they started, but only like this. But there is this mid-phase of much more complicated that they'll do. When we model merge, too, another important thing to remember when it looks crazy, like most of us can think about it in that way, what we tend to do, what I do is I remove all the arrows and make them discuss, you put this term in, you put that term, are they the same thing? Yes, kick it out. All right, you're talking about this, you're talking about it in that way, what do we think? And so, and sometimes, well, that's so specific, they'll argue. This is more general, this is likely gonna happen here. Oh, well, that one. And so, so in that respect, we don't go back to drawing arrows until we really reduce the amount of terms that we think makes sense for the phenomenon. So there is a thinking, a cognitive limitation to what we can use this tool for that I think really puts the pressure. Now, for the middle school students, we don't always have them do a model merge. And in fact, most of those contexts, they didn't do it at all. That when they're looking at alternative scenarios and testing alternative ideas, the students came up with it. When it comes to decision making, and we have different disciplines, right, in an interdisciplinary classroom coming together, or in the case where I talked about that climate model where we had different disciplines coming together, we merged and we spent a great deal of time paring down terms and then putting up a system and then beginning to say, okay, what happens if this isn't a factor, this is too much of a factor, and that caused a pare down. And so it's a process, and it's one that some educators are not on game for. They've got too much to do, too much to cover. I argue, and I can still see some of the students who were part of that one class and say, hey, tell me about eutrophication, because unfortunately they got me through several classes, and they still can do it, and so to me it's worth it. But you saw, we covered nitrification, eutrophication, and a little bit of carbon in this entire class. So that is the trade-off that some people are just not comfortable with. But the idea of simplified tool for thinking is always the goal. And so if we can get there at the end, great.
Okay,
right.
one more question. So, if I'm thinking about modeling too, I'm thinking that oftentimes the key variables are invisible to the students at the beginning.
Yeah.
Like matter cycling and energy flow. That's a powerful part of a productive model, but it's not something that you see when the fish die.
Yeah.
So how do they get there, or do they get there?
They do, and again, because it's not partless, it's not evidenceless, it's not dataless, and so they absolutely, they have to look, and that's what I like, because in some cases, we're really pushing that inferential thinking, right? Where we're seeing, and because that's why we do think about nitrification a little bit in the fish tank, where, through some of the simulation tools and through some of the data that they actually collect. Now again, they can think about ammonia and pee, but it usually takes a very sophisticated student, and sometimes hinting by the teacher, to say, well, pee, nitrate, and talk a little bit about that. And in 7th grade in New Jersey in these classrooms, they have gone through, once you get say the word nitrogen, they do kind of understand a little bit about terrestrial nitrogen cycle, so we can hint them to that level. But now they're starting to see, like nitrates, they're starting to see these substances go up and down, and they're sort of saying, oh, I wonder what that is. And so, and we simulated something like that in the pond. What often they'll come up with is that they'll see some of these substances happening, and in the pond scenario, they'll say, well, all right, the algae killed the fish. That's exactly what happens. That's what happens in eutrophication. Poisonous algae grow, and they kill the fish. And so they're missing some invisible parts there. And so, and depending on how kind I am, I'll let them try to, I'll give them a species of algae, and they'll look into it and think, oh gosh, normally they don't kill the fish. Why did they kill it in this case? And then start to think about what else is happening. A second model that they tend to come up with, and it's amazing how quickly they'll fall into line behind each other, like, yeah, that's absolutely it, is that it'll overshadow everything, and then there can be no oxygen beneath it, because the plants are stopping all the oxygen. And so, and often I'll get students sometimes who say, yeah, or the plants that produce too much CO2, that's the problem. And usually that kind of thinking of too much CO2 starts to get them thinking a little bit about CO2 and O2, which isn't the worst way to go with this. But then there are other students who will sort of sit there and, wait, aren't plants, now it'll be amazing how they'll sit there and they'll say, gosh, I thought plants, photosynthesis, I thought oxygen, was the outcome. Am I wrong? So we'll hear them question it, and it's like, well, you're a third-year bio student. What do you think? You think you're wrong? How confident are you? And I let them too. They can Wikipedia and stuff. And I'm sure, and I tell the ones who run it, if you're looking all this stuff up, you're going to find pretty good examples. Don't tell everybody else, if you choose to use your brain that way. But then once they move from that kind of idea that there is, like, the plants blocking oxygen, what else could be using oxygen, the idea of decomposition and what that looks like. And so somebody will say, well, what's eating it? And often kids, even at the 7th grade level, all the way up through college, if they feel like they can't figure out what it is, it's a bacteria, And so then we confront what is a bacteria versus other things that are invisible, so we get there. And there's often multiple paths, and I can sort of tell now enough by having thought about it, when they start coming up with something that I know is probably not, it's less, might consider by an expert to be less accurate, but actually it's probably getting them a little closer to the idea that there are these, the gases play a role in nitrification and what that means. And so that's supported by simulations, it's supported by data, and again, having them pair multiple sources of data together to say, and that's where they sometimes come up with this, we must not be able to see it, but it must be there kind of feeling. And so, yeah, they get there.
Good, well, thank you. I'm sure people will